Hello, today we're going to complete chapters 11 and 12. We're going to talk about how we're going to decide on the audit approach we're going to take. We're going to start out with private companies that don't have to file with the SEC. They're not covered by Sarbanes-Oxley. After evaluating the design of the controls, you do not believe the controls would prevent or detect incorrect misstatements. You believe the client's internal controls are not effective. You preliminarily assess control risk as high, and you'll take a primarily substantive audit approach. You believe it would cost less to perform tested controls than substantive tests. I'm still going to take a substantive approach. If the controls are ineffective, what will performing tested controls accomplish? So we're going to spend money to test controls to get evidence that their controls are in fact not effective. And then we have to go ahead and spend more money performing the primarily substantive approach because their controls weren't effective. So for a private company, if we don't believe the controls are effective, we aren't going to test the controls. We're just going to move straight to the substantive test and take a primarily substantive approach. We always evaluate the design of the controls. That's part of our understanding of the internal controls. Private company, we aren't required to perform tested controls. Analytical procedures, in Ted's world, we're always going to do them because they're cheap. And then we're going to be required to do extensive substantive test. Okay. After evaluating the design of the controls, you believe the controls are effective. They would prevent or detect and correct. You preliminarily assess control risk is low. We're going to take a reduced level control risk approach. We believe that tested controls would cost less than substantive test. That's what we're hoping for. We'll continue to take a reduced level of control risk approach. Always evaluate design. If we're taking a reduced level control risk approach, we're going to have to perform extensive tested controls. Always do analytical procedures. Auditing standards require that we always perform some substantive test. We refer to that as limited. After evaluating the design of the controls, we believe the controls would be effective. But we believe it would cost less to perform substantive tests than tested controls. We're going to take a primarily substantive approach. We can achieve our objective of reducing audit risk to a low level either by assessing control risk is low and testing controls, or by performing extensive substantive tests. Since we can achieve our goal either way, we're going to take the approach that is least costly. Always evaluate the design. Private company, not required to test controls. Analytical procedures, yes. An extensive substantive test. Private companies. Okay, the only time we're going to take the reduced level of control risk approach is when we believe the controls are effective and we believe it will be less costly to test controls than performing substantive tests. If controls are ineffective, we don't really have any choice. If the controls aren't effective, we can't rely on them. Therefore, we're going to have to perform extensive substantive tests. If the controls are effective, but we believe substantive tests are less costly, we're going to take the primarily substantive approach because we can achieve our objective for less cost. Private company, we're required to obtain an understanding of the internal controls. document our understanding, evaluate the design of those controls, preliminarily assess control risk, document our preliminary control risk assessment. If control risk is low and tested controls are cheaper, then we're going to design and perform extensive test of controls, document the results of our test and controls and our final control risk assessment, design and perform limited substantive test. If the controls are effective, then we can limit the extent of our substantive testing and document the results of our substantive test. If controls are ineffective or substantive tests are cheaper, then we're going to design and perform extensive substantive test and document the results of our substantive test. Public companies. These companies are covered by Sarbanes-Oxley. They file with the SEC. After evaluating the design of the controls, you believe they would prevent or detect and correct. We believe they will be effective. We preliminarily assess control risk is low. We're going to take a reduced level of control risk approach. You believe it will cost less to perform tested controls. Good, that's what we're hoping for. We'll take a reduced level of control risk approach. Okay, we'll always evaluate the design, reduced level of control risk approach. We perform extensive tested controls, always perform analytical procedures, and we perform limited substantive tests because auditing procedures require us to always perform some substantive test. Same scenario, controls are effective. We preliminarily assess control risk is low, but we believe it would cost less to perform substantive tests than tested controls. This is a public company, so we're still going to take a reduced level control risk approach even though the controls are effective and we believe substantive tests are cheaper. Okay, for a public company, the cost of substantive test is almost irrelevant. Why? Well, because we're going to evaluate the design and perform extensive tested controls. Now, the reason the cost is not an issue for a public company is we have to issue a report on both the financial statements and the effectiveness of the internal controls. So management is going to want us to express an opinion that their controls are effective. So they're going to be willing to pay that we go ahead and do the extensive testing of tested controls, even though that may be more expensive, more costly than a primarily substantive approach, because we want to be able, and they want us to be able, to express an opinion that their controls are in fact effective. Always do analytical procedures, and we can limit our substantive testing. Okay, next scenario. After evaluating the design of the controls, you do not believe they would be effective. They're ineffective. Preliminarily assess control risk is high. Take a primarily substantive approach. If controls are ineffective, we're going to have to take a primarily substantive approach. We're going to have to perform extensive substantive tests. But for a public company, we're always going to do some test of controls. We're going to issue a report on whether their controls are effective or not effective. We're going to need evidence. Even if we don't believe their controls are effective, we need evidence that their controls, in fact, are not effective. So we're going to have to do some tested controls. Some is Tad's word. That's not a profession word. My belief is It usually takes less evidence to show that controls are ineffective than it does to prove controls are effective. We only have to detect one material misstatement to have evidence that the controls are not effective. So it's not none. I don't believe it will be extensive. It's some. It's however much it takes to prove that the controls, in fact, are not effective. Always do analytical procedures. Since the controls are not effective, we're going to have to perform extensive substantive tests. Public company. If we believe the controls are effective, we're always going to take a reduced level of control risk approach. Remember, for a public company, we're going to express two opinions. One, that the financial statements are fairly presented. One, that the controls are effective. In order to give that second opinion that the controls are effective, we need to perform extensive tested controls. If we believe the controls are ineffective, we're going to have to take a primarily substantive approach because we can't rely on their controls. So we're going to have to do extensive substantive tests. However, in order to express an opinion that their controls are ineffective, we're going to have evidence. We can't just say they're ineffective. We need evidence to support that opinion. So we're going to have to do some tested controls. Public company, we're always required to understand the internal control, document our understanding, evaluate the design effectiveness of the internal controls, design and perform tested controls to assess control risk, document the results of those tested controls, and document our final control risk assessment. If controls are effective, control risk is low, we're going to design and perform limited substantive tests, and we'll have to document the results. If control risk is not low, then we're going to have to design and perform extensive substantive tests and document those results. Document. Okay, so I don't think we get across in class how important documentation is. But it's hugely important that you document what you did and the results of what you did. That was the last video for this chapter. Have a good day, and I'll see you next week.